Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a really fascinating exploration. Child development. Imagine it's a scientific look at how we grow, how we change, and how we sort of stay, ourselves, right from the very beginning, conception, all the way through the teenage years.
Absolutely. And to really get a handle on this journey, we're drawing on knowledge from quite diverse fields: biology, psychology, anthropology, sociology, even education.
Okay.
Think of it like weaving together all these different threads to get a much richer picture. And the central aim really is understanding and improving children's lives.
Okay, so when we talk about this big picture of child development, what are the main areas that researchers tend to focus on?
Generally, we look at three key areas. First, there's physical development. That's everything from getting bigger, changes in our bodies, developing motor skills, puberty, all that physical stuff.
Right.
Then you've got cognitive development. That's all about how we learn, remember, reason, use language, develop our intellectual abilities, basically how our thinking changes.
Thinking. Okay.
And finally, there's social and personality development. This looks at how our relationships, our emotions, and our unique individual traits kind of evolve over time.
And this whole period, conception to, say, late teens, it's not just one long, uniform stretch, is it? I imagine there are different phases people look at.
Exactly. Yeah, we often break it down into what we call socially constructed age ranges. It just helps us understand typical patterns.
Makes sense.
So we start with the prenatal period, that's conception to birth. Then comes infancy and toddlerhood, which is roughly birth to about age 3.
Okay.
The preschool years follow, usually 3 to 6. Middle childhood is generally considered 6 to 12. And then adolescence kicks in, say, 12 to around 20.
Right.
And it's interesting, these divisions aren't purely biological. They reflect societal expectations, the roles we assign at different life stages.
Oh, really? Like adolescence?
Yeah, the whole idea of adolescence as this distinct phase, that's actually a pretty recent thing, historically speaking.
Huh. And it seems pretty obvious that kids reach these milestones at different times. Like, some might walk early, others talk later. There's a lot of individual variation, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are really substantial differences in when developmental events happen. And what's really insightful is how much our environment, our cultural context can shape this timing.
How so?
Well, think about something like the practice of child marriage in some cultures. It's a stark example, but it really shows how cultural norms can profoundly influence when major life events are sort of expected to occur.
Wow, yeah. That really highlights how biology isn't the only player here. So how do those broader cultural aspects, culture, ethnicity, influence development overall?
Oh, deeply. Culture, ethnicity, race.
Yeah.
They really affect child-rearing practices, what goals a society values for development.
Like politeness or maturity.
Exactly. What's seen as polite or a sign of maturity can vary so much across cultures. And this, it also presents challenges for researchers, just finding the right words, the most appropriate and respectful ways to even talk about diversity.
Yeah, I can imagine. It must be quite complex trying to categorize people for research, especially now with more and more individuals coming from multi-ethnic backgrounds. How does that affect the findings?
Precisely. It's a real issue. How we categorize people in research, it has direct consequences for how accurate, how useful our findings actually are. We need to be really thoughtful, avoid oversimplifying. Like, let's think about the difference between collectivistic and individualistic orientations.
Okay, what are those?
So in collectivistic cultures, often found in Asian societies, there's a strong emphasis on interdependence, the group's well-being. Think of a family where a child's success reflects on everyone, lots of mutual support.
Right.
Individualistic cultures, more common in Western societies, tend to prioritize, the uniqueness, the independence of each person.
And these frameworks affect everything.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
From how parents raise kids to how kids see themselves. It's fundamental.
And then there's the whole race versus ethnicity thing. It feels like those terms get tangled up sometimes, but they mean different things, don't they?
That's a really critical clarification, yeah. Race, well, it was originally thought of as a biological category based on physical traits.
But it's not really biological.
The scientific consensus now is no, it's not a biologically meaningful way to group people. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is much broader. It's about shared cultural background, nationality, religion, language, a common heritage.
Okay.
And what's interesting now is the ongoing discussion about the best terms to use. Like, you hear preferences for African American versus Black, for example.
Right.
And as demographics keep changing, understanding these distinctions is, well, it's increasingly important.
So it's not just individual differences in culture, but also like when you were born matters. You mentioned cohort effects.
Exactly. A cohort is just a group of people born around the same time in the same place. And they experience the world uniquely because of the historical period they lived through.
Okay.
These cohort effects, they show up in different ways. You have history-graded influences, big events like a war or, a pandemic that impact a whole generation.
Yeah, makes sense.
Then age-graded influences. Those are milestones tied to age, like starting school or puberty. Sociocultural graded influences involve things like social class or ethnicity, affecting cohorts differently.
Right.
And finally, non-normative life events. These are unexpected, significant things like a serious illness or a natural disaster that can really shape an individual's development.
Wow. It's fascinating how much your birth year alone can influence things. Okay, let's shift gears a bit, step back in time. What were some of the earliest views on childhood? It's hard to picture a time when kids weren't seen as, well, special.
Well, if you go back to medieval Europe, say before 1600, the historian Philippe Arias argued that children didn't really have a special status.
Really?
Yeah, the view was largely that they were just like miniature imperfect adults. You even see it in old paintings, kids wearing the same clothes as adults.
That's such a different picture. So what changed? Were there thinkers who challenged that?
Yes, definitely. Philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau had contrasting but really significant ideas. Locke came up with tabula rasa, the blank slate idea.
Ah, shaped by experience.
Exactly. The child is born blank, experience writes on the slate. Rousseau, though, he had this noble savages idea. He thought children were born inherently good, with a natural sense of morality.
Interesting contrast.
Yeah, and these different views kind of laid the groundwork for actually studying childhood more systematically.
And that's where baby biographies fit in. Tell me about those.
Right. Late 18th century, especially in Germany, you start seeing these baby biographies. They were really the first methodical attempts to study child development.
So parents keeping diaries.
Often, yeah. Observers meticulously recording a child's growth. Even Charles Darwin kept a detailed record of his own son's first year. It helped bring a more, shall we say, scientific lens to studying kids.
So moving from philosophy to actual observation, what else was going on in society that kind of pushed childhood into the spotlight?
Well, several things. As the workforce changed, there was less need for child labor, so laws came in to protect kids.
Right, child labor laws.
Exactly. And the rise of universal education was huge, recognizing kids needed a dedicated time for learning. Plus, psychology as a field started emphasizing how much childhood experiences impact adult life.
Okay, fast forward to the 20th century. It sounds like that's when child development really took off as its own field.
Oh, absolutely. The 20th century is when it really emerged as a distinct discipline. You had key figures like Alfred Binet doing early intelligence tests,
Okay.
G. Stanley Hall, a major figure in child psychology, Lita Hollingworth studying gifted kids, Marie Montessori with her educational methods.
A lot happening.
Definitely. And we also saw the start of these big long-term studies, like the Stanford Studies of Gifted Children, the Fels Research Institute study, the Berkeley Growth and Guidance studies. They provided amazing insights by following people over many, many years.
Yeah, those longitudinal studies must be invaluable. Okay, so bringing us to today, what are some of the central questions, the big debates that are still driving research in child development?
There are several really fundamental questions still at the core. One is the whole continuous versus discontinuous change debate.
Meaning?
Does development happen gradually, smoothly, each step building on the last? Or does it happen in distinct stages where new abilities kind of emerge at different points?
Like steps on a staircase versus a ramp.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And the truth is, most researchers now think it's probably a mix of both, depending on what specific aspect of development you're looking at.
Okay, that makes sense. It's probably not just one or the other. What about critical periods versus sensitive periods? I hear those terms thrown around.
Right. They relate to the timing of environmental influences. A critical period is thought of as a specific window where a particular event, or lack of it, has the biggest impact. Like language development early on is often cited.
Okay, has to happen then.
That was the original idea. A sensitive period, though, is a time when you're particularly receptive to certain experiences, but, and this is key, the effects of missing out might be reversible later.
Ah, so more flexible.
Exactly. The field's really shifted away from a strict focus on critical periods towards appreciating sensitive periods, and the brain's plasticity, its ability to adapt and change. It's less about hard deadlines, more about windows of opportunity.
So less use it or lose it immediately, more best time to learn it. Interesting. Has the focus of what gets studied changed too?
Definitely. Early on, a lot of focus was on infancy and adolescence, seen as the most critical times. But now, contemporary theories really embrace a lifespan perspective, meaning recognizing that growth and change happen throughout our entire lives, and all these different periods are interconnected. You don't just stop developing after adolescence.
Right, and we absolutely cannot talk about development without hitting the big one. Nature versus nurture, genes versus environment. How much of who we are is baked in, how much is learned?
Ah, yes, the age-old question. The relative influence of nature. Our genetic inheritance, maturation, and nurture, all those environmental influences, it's foundational.
And it has big implications, right?
Huge implications for how we think about raising kids, for social policy, especially when you talk about things like intelligence. Where does that come from?
So where does the field stand now? Is it one or the other?
No, the current understanding is really that it's not an either situation. It's a complex, ongoing interaction between our genetic predispositions and all our experiences.
Yeah.
They constantly influence each other.
Okay, looking ahead then, what are some of the key trends or areas likely to shape where child development research goes next?
Well, we're definitely seeing more specialization. Researchers are digging deeper into really specific aspects of development.
Makes sense.
Advances in genetics undoubtedly will give us even deeper insights into why we differ and how development unfolds. The increasing diversity of populations worldwide means research has to become more nuanced, more culturally informed. And we'll see ongoing progress in research methods. Plus, I think, a growing public interest in applying findings to tackle real-world societal issues.
Speaking of societal issues, one that seems particularly pressing is children and violence. I know that's a major area of research.
It is indeed a very significant and worrying one. Researchers are looking at the roots of violence from many angles.
Like what?
Well, looking at links between early behavior problems and later aggression, exploring the potential impact of media, video games.
The screen time debate?
Right. There are fundamental questions. What drives the levels of violence we see? How do kids learn aggressive behaviors? And crucially, how can we prevent it? How can we effectively intervene?
It sounds incredibly complex.
It is. It involves studying everything from the effects of major events, like the pandemic's impact on abuse rates, to understanding bullying dynamics, school violence, and developing programs that actually work.
Such a critical area. Okay, finally, for anyone listening who's trying to make sense of all the information out there about child development, parenting advice, news articles, you name it, what advice would you give on how to evaluate that information critically?
That's such an important question. First, always consider the source. Who is providing this information? How current is it?
Check the credentials.
Absolutely. Check the credentials of the person or organization. Be really wary of anecdotal evidence, personal stories. Prioritize information that's based on actual scientific research.
Okay.
Also, always think about the cultural context. Is this advice relevant to your situation? And maybe most importantly, just because lots of people believe something doesn't make it true. Public opinion isn't the same as scientific fact.
So critical thinking is key.
It really is your best tool.
That's incredibly helpful. So to sort of wrap up our deep dive into child development, we've covered a lot of ground. We've looked at the definition, the scope, the interplay of individual differences in culture, historical views, those core debates like nature, nurture, continuous, discontinuous change. And we've looked towards the future, including really pressing issues like violence.
And it really underscores just how complex and dynamic the whole process of how children grow and develop truly is. It's constantly evolving.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which brings me to a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe mull over. Considering this incredibly dynamic interaction between nature and nurture that we've talked about, what single societal shift do you believe would have the most significant positive impact on the well-being and development of children, not just here, but worldwide? Definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.